Nazi Germany invaded Poland 85 years ago this month, sparking World War II. By the end of the war, the Nazis and their collaborators would go on to murder 3 million Jews in Poland. That's 90% of Poland's pre-war Jewish population. But in the face of unimaginable persecution, many Jews in Warsaw resisted the Nazis in creative and unexpected ways. Thanks for tuning in today. My name is Lisa Leff, and I'm a historian at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Today, we will be talking about how a brave group of Jewish people who were imprisoned in the Warsaw Ghetto took great risks to document Jewish life and preserve the evidence of Nazi crimes while they were happening. We'll also be learning about the dedication of survivors to uncover the truth that had been hidden in that secret archive years later. And we have a wonderful guest today for our discussion. I'm pleased to welcome Roberta Grossman. She is the writer, director, and producer of the documentary film, Who Will Write Our History, which tells this remarkable story. Hi, Roberta.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And to our viewers, if you have questions along the way, please send them in and we will answer as many as possible during our program. Now, I want to begin by sort of setting the scene. Soon after the war began, German authorities immediately started targeting Jews in Poland. And then, a year later in 1940, they forced over 400,000 Jewish people into a ghetto in Warsaw that covered 1.5 miles. Can you tell us about the conditions in the ghetto?
Well, the conditions in the ghetto were miserable, truly awful. There was tremendous overcrowding because of the small space so many people were crowded into. And the overcrowding contributed to a lot of disease. And then the Nazis only allowed for about 800 calories a day for each person. It requires about 2,000 to keep an adult even alive. So there was a lot of death, and the hunger led to disease, and the disease led to death. And there was also sort of a moral collapse. People who had had these very full, vibrant lives in the capital of Warsaw were now basically just imprisoned with nothing to do except suffer.
Yeah, at its peak, about 450,000 people were crammed into this ghetto. It's not just the Jews who had lived in Warsaw. Many refugees also came there. And because it was such a small part of the town, you had multiple families living together in apartments. And there was really an atmosphere of terror, with German guards going around humiliating, beating, torturing people on the street. And then in November 1940, the Germans sealed up the ghetto so that you couldn't go in or out. Everyone was locked inside. I want to turn now, though, to ask you, Roberta, about the social worker and historian, Emanuel Ringelblum, who was living in the ghetto.
So I'm really grateful to Sam Casso, who wrote his book, Who Will Write Our History, which is about Emanuel Ringelblum and his life and work. Ringelblum is, in my opinion, one of the great historical figures and leaders of Jewish history. To me, he should be on a statue next to statues of Moses. He was a historian, as you mentioned. He taught at a girls' school before the war. He was very involved politically. And also before the war, even before the war started, he was involved in Jewish self-help. And that work, all of that work would continue once in the ghetto. And he was fortunate enough, he and his wife, Judita, and son Uri, that their home was actually inside the border of the ghetto. So he was able to stay there, and that would end up being very important because they had all of their belongings, and later on they could sell them as hunger became so prevalent.
I want to just share a comment that one of our viewers sent us, Myra. She says she agrees with you that Ringelblum was a great man. He was a teacher and a mentor to her father, whose name was Jacob Israel Weisbord. Myra added that Jacob idolized Ringelblum so much that his photo is hanging up in their apartment. It's amazing to meet someone.
That's really wonderful.
Yeah.
I mean, he was one. I mean, one of the amazing things about Ringelblum was how energetic he was. I mean, he never stopped. You know, during the day he was teaching, he was working on, you know, books about Jewish history, specifically about Warsaw Jewish history. He was very involved politically at night. He was always tutoring, you know, workers. He was working in the self-help. He was a very energetic fellow.
Right. And it's kind of amazing that he continued to be that energetic in these horrific times, as you were describing. And that as a historian, he turned to documenting. Do you want to tell us something about how he went about documenting life in the ghetto?
Sure. I mean, Ringelblum realized that unfortunately he was living through very historic times and realized that the Nazis were intent not only on destroying Jewish bodies, but also on Jewish souls, and also in owning the Jewish story. And that was sort of an ultimate kind of death that he wanted to prevent. So he wanted to do everything that he could to, in the moment, collect stories and ephemera, everything that for later on, that Jewish historians could write the history of the war from the Jewish point of view.
Mm-hmm. And that's why your documentary film, based on Sam Casso's book, is called Who Will Write Our History, right?
Correct. It was very important. I mean, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want my most profound enemy, who, you know, hated me enough to want to destroy me and everything I cared about, to write my obituary.
Yeah. Now, in your film, you show many of the items that this group, Oneg Shabbat, documented and collected in the ghetto. Can we look at some of these and have you tell us about them?
Sure. So Ringelblum's, he gathered about 8 people only around him as an executive committee. They started meeting on Saturdays shortly after the ghetto was closed. And the instruction to them was that everything was important, to collect everything, to record everything. So each of them was writing, collecting the writing of others, reporting, because many of the members of the Oneg Shabbos were kept alive by working for the Jewish self-help that Ringelblum was the head of. They were able to go into orphanages and refugee centers and collect everything from what you're seeing here, which was Jewish underground newspapers, poetry, diaries, tickets, armbands, of course, the ghetto goods, everything, basically Ringelblum's instruction was that everything is important, nothing is unimportant.
Right. He was a historian from the bottom up, and that really informed this collecting effort.
Right.
I want to mention another person involved in this effort whose name was Hirsch Wasser. Mm-hmm. He wrote about what they were doing, and I found his words really interesting. He wrote, "Warsaw is filled with the sound of music. The belly is empty, but the ears are full." Roberta, can you unpack this quote for us?
Sure.
As we look at some of the items? Yeah.
Wasser was Ringelblum's executive secretary, his most trusted confidant. And it's true that it wasn't just the Oneg Shabbos and the cultural and spiritual resistance that they were engaging in, but Jews in the ghetto were trying to remain themselves, trying to remain human. And of course, art and culture was a big part of interwar life, and it continued to be in the ghetto. So children's theater, children's education, professional theater, professional concerts, musicians in the street, maintaining Jewish traditions, rituals. It was illegal to meet to pray, but they continued to do so. There was even a mikveh in the ghetto.
Wow. Yeah, it's really amazing, going back to what you were saying at the beginning about the conditions, that they mustered the strength, like the physical strength, but also the mental strength to keep doing all of this cultural work, to live as fully as possible. In a way, if we didn't know the full story of what they were enduring, if we just looked at all this explosion of cultural life, we would think it was normal. But of course, we know also from what they documented that was not at all the case.
Well, that's the beauty of the Oneg Shabbos and recording in the moment, because as Sam Casso says, if you had survived the ghetto and then gone to camps or whatever, you might not remember the cultural performances in the ghetto. You might not remember the cost of bread on any given day because of the terrible inflation. So that the in the moment testimony is just critical.
Yeah. You included in your film a detailed diary entry from Ringelblum when he wrote about people starving in the ghetto and the many dangerous ways that they responded to that with smuggling. Let's take a look.
Smuggling was done, 1, across the walls, 2, at exit points, 3, through underground tunnels, 4, through the sewers, and 5, through holes in houses bordering on the Aryan side. If one had wanted really to restrict oneself to the official rations, then the entire population of the ghetto would have died of hunger in a very short time.
You know, I just want to note about, we were hearing Ringelblum's diary being read, but I want to note that the film itself, unlike what we were showing earlier, which were items, you know, documented and collected by Ringelblum and his team, that footage we just saw was actually filmed by the Germans. It was Nazi propaganda designed to paint Jews in a negative light, right?
Right. So it was quite ironic. I mean, there were crews of people shooting film and taking photographs, Nazis in the ghetto all the time. And you have to ask the question, what was the point? And it was all part of Nazi propaganda to show the Jews as dirty, in this case, as criminal, as breaking the law. There is footage of showing, you know, and at first you don't understand it. There's a footage of a well-dressed woman walking over the corpse of a Jewish woman walking over a Jewish corpse. Why? And then you see that there is take after take after take. As the woman becomes more and more terrified, she's being instructed by a Nazi to do this over and over again. And it's to show that the Jews don't care about each other. And, you know, it's always propaganda. And yet it is in the place and time of which we have very little record. So it's priceless.
Right. I want to read a comment by one of our viewers. Donna wrote, "It is so important to chronicle the horrors as they happen, before they're whitewashed by the group committing them. The founder of the group had great insight. Bless all those who risk everything to record the hell they were living."
Yeah, and she's absolutely right. But it's not just that the crime committers are whitewashing. Often the survivors themselves begin to change what they say. Everyone who died was a martyr, and everyone who survived was a hero. And at the time, you know, there's this burning anger, for example, at the Jewish police in the ghetto, and Jews who informed to the Nazis. And you know, I'm not in a position to judge. I don't think any of us are. But there's a lot of anger within the Jews being angry with other Jews about how they were behaving. And you don't get that from survivor testimony.
Right. You had, I mean, that's what Ringelblum said. You had to break the law in order to survive. So people are living in this really difficult position. I mean, even the work of Oneg Shabbat itself was illegal. And that meant, you know, you show in your film that secrecy was an absolute must. Will you tell us about how they kept from being discovered?
Right. Well, so I don't know. I mean, the Nazis didn't take too well to anybody criticizing them or organizing against them. There was a lot of collective punishment, and you didn't need to really do anything to be killed. Shortly after that film was taken of those children smuggling, it became illegal to go across to the other side. And as a matter of fact, people were executed. You know, women who were going across to get a potato for their children were executed for doing so. So the members of the Oneg Shabbos, there were about 60 of them. Ultimately, not all of them knew they were members of the Oneg Shabbos or knew one another. There was a lot of secrecy, so that if someone was arrested, they could not, for example, tell where the archive was being housed. That was done on purpose. So they were literally risking their lives to tell the truth.
Wow. I want to focus us in now on one of the members of this secret group, Rachel Auerbach. She was based in a ghetto soup kitchen, and she used that as both cover for her work, but she also wrote about it, right?
So Rachel Auerbach was on the verge. She was a member of Ringelblum's intelligentsia and Yiddishist milieu before the war. Here she's in a picture. You see her. She's the only woman in the picture, and Ringelblum's on the far left. She really loved and admired Ringelblum. And when he asked her to stay at the outbreak of the war, when she was about to leave to join her family, he asked her to stay and run a soup kitchen. And he said to her, "We can't all run away." So she stayed. She ran a soup kitchen. And the soup kitchen turned out to be a remarkable place to observe what was happening in the ghetto. And she wrote about it. And then afterwards, she continued to rewrite her ghetto writings. So her writing is really, really remarkable. She talks about the waves of refugees coming into the soup kitchen, coming into the ghetto, eating at the soup kitchen. The soup kitchen and other resources could not keep them alive. They would die, and another group of refugees would take their place. She also writes about the people and the women working with her in the soup kitchen and the incredible moral dilemmas that they all faced working in a soup kitchen in a starving world.
Wow. Let's turn actually to listen to a passage that she wrote, which describes the starvation and suffering that she was witnessing in that soup kitchen.
The song of hunger, sung publicly in courtyards and stairwells, those who will soon be found dead on the edges of sidewalks. They wander on swollen feet, their eyes searching. They ask for pity, crying and wailing and lamenting the pain of hunger on the eve of their demise. It haunts each ghetto resident, even in their nightmares, a sort of choir recital forever remaining engraved in the memory of those who will be fortunate enough to survive.
It's amazing what you said about how she chose, that she had a chance to not be in the ghetto and she chose to be there. And I know Ringelblum also had chances to get out and chose not to because he felt so strongly.
He was in Switzerland, I believe, at a Zionist conference on the eve of the war, and he came back. I mean, of course, his wife and son, who he adored, were there as well. But both Ringelblum and Auerbach, at almost the identical time, not at all in coordination with each other, wrote in their diaries about the ethical dilemmas of, he read, because he collected everything, he read Auerbach's writing, where she says, are we to, basically, should we give everybody a spoonful of food and everybody dies? Or should we give more to a selected few, and how do we choose who they are, so that some will survive? And they were very pained by that. And Ringelblum writes about hearing crying children at night, and the members of the archive talk about what is the ethics of passing starving children. What do you do when you have your own children at home to feed? So Barbara Kirschengat-Glimlot, who's in the film, wonderful scholar, says that the Germans everywhere imposed choiceless choices on Jewish people during the Holocaust.
Yeah, that's exactly what you were talking about earlier, that survivors, it would be so hard for survivors to talk about that because once you're not in those conditions anymore, it's very hard to understand these ethics.
Right.
I know early on, Ringelblum and his team were documenting because they believed that if they got this information out, someone somewhere, the Allies, for example, would do something about what the Nazis were up to and would rescue the Jews. How did they get information out?
Well, I mean, Ringelblum was and his team, where they were very methodical and very careful, historians, statisticians, economists. They knew that they needed to get out not emotional information about what they were suffering, but factual information that could prove that the Nazis were engaged in mass murder. So because refugees and escapees were coming from all over Poland into Warsaw, and they would seek out Ringelblum to tell them what was happening, or other members of the Onyx Shabbos, or they would seek them out. They knew about Homo. They knew about the death by bullets. So they were able to amass statistics, hard statistics, and smuggle out a report to the Polish underground, to the Polish government in exile in London, and they were able to get to the Allies. And Ringelblum, actually, they had illicit, illegal listening stations where they had heard a BBC broadcast. They knew that they succeeded. It's a miraculous thing. They succeeded in getting out the message. And it was announced on the BBC that the Germans were engaged in mass murder. Well, it would follow, of course, that the Allies were going to come and rescue them. And when weeks and months happened and the Great Deportation started, it was crushing to know that, well, they had been left alone.
Yeah. And I want to just highlight what you just ended with, which is that there was a Great Deportation before the Allies got anywhere. So in July 1942, the Germans began deporting hundreds of thousands of Jews out of the Warsaw Ghetto, sending them to killing centers, especially Treblinka, right? It was an environment of chaos and terror at the time of the Great Deportation. What happened to the secret group, Roberta?
Well, many of the members of the Onyx Shabbos were deported day after day. Abraham Lewin, who's a very important member of the Onyx Shabbos, whose diary was published in English as A Cup of Tears. Is quite powerful writing. And but they cared so much about writing and recording the story in the moment that he continued writing in his diary even on the day that he discovered his wife, Luba, had been deported. So the Oneg Shabbos was those members who were still standing after the Great Deportation continued. But even on the eve of the Great Deportation, while it was underway, they buried the first cache of the archive. They realized, like, we don't have any more time. They buried 10 boxes. And here you see a photograph of some of the boxes. And they buried everything that they had collected until then. And it's part of the remarkable trove that survived to tell us what had happened to them.
Wow. So maybe that answers our viewer's question. Veronica wrote, how do we have these? How did they survive? You're saying they were buried in these tins.
Right. And then later they were buried in metal milk cans. And one of them at the Holocaust Museum, and one of them in Warsaw at the Jewish Historical Institute. And because these milk cans were created to hold liquid, they also kept liquid out. There's a lot of water underground, and the materials that were buried in the tin boxes did not fare as well as those in the milk cans.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that the milk cans, if I'm not mistaken, held Ringelblum's diary and many other invaluable pieces of testimony.
One of the most haunting documents in that archive is called A Last Will and Testament, written by a very young man, the 19-year-old David Graeber. And I want to read something he wrote about what the group was up to. He wrote, "What we were unable to cry and shriek out to the world, we buried in the ground. I would love to see the moment in which the great treasure will be dug up and scream the truth at the world so they may know all," right? That document was among those 35,000 documents that were buried before, this is after the Great Deportation, before the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, which started in April 1943, so the next year, when a group of Jewish armed fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto rose up against the Nazis, fearing that they were about to be deported. We remember this moment as the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And the Germans respond with massive fire and destruction, destroying the resistance eventually after their brave uprising, and scorching the ghetto, right, turning it into ruin. When you think about this story that you've been telling us about the Oneg Shabbos group, it is amazing that these milk cans and these tins were able to survive given the destruction of everything.
Right. I mean, for me, I don't use the miracle lightly, but it really is a miracle that they survived and that they were found.
Yeah. Then I think back to David's words, they're such a powerful example of how writing was used and how it helped people hold on to a sense of who they were, their dignity. Roberta, what are your thoughts about all of this writing that Jews were doing under Nazi persecution?
Well, as historian David Roski says in the film Who Write Our History, everywhere Jews were writing. And he said everyone was writing, old people, young people, everyone was writing. And that writing was a way to maintain control or to retain one's sense of one's own humanity and one's own knowledge of who am I if I write. And also, I'm quite moved by the writing of the Oneg Shabbos because it's clear that the overarching goal of telling the history of the Jews from the history of the war from the Jewish point of view is one goal, but it's also a goal of somebody like David Graeber to be remembered as individuals. They're not statistics, they're individuals. And writing was a way to preserve a sense of meaning, a sense of value of oneself. And we are very grateful to those who were able to write in those circumstances.
Yeah, it's how we know what happened.
All right.
I want to turn now to talking about Rachel Auerbach, who was one of only 3 members of that secret group to survive the Holocaust. How did she ensure that this amazing time capsule was eventually discovered?
Well, Rachel Auerbach was what might be termed today a difficult woman. which means that she was extremely vocal and extremely persistent. Like everybody else, she had been evacuated from Warsaw during the Warsaw uprising and the bombing that ensued, the way that the Germans just pulverized all of Warsaw. She came back, and there were commemorations for the uprising and for the ghetto that started right away. And at one of these commemorations, she stood up and said, "Thank you very much for your speeches about the heroism of the fighters," which of course they were heroic. "But you know, there's a national treasure buried underneath the rubble of the ghetto, and we must find it, and we must find it now." And she did not let up until she was able to basically hand crank efforts to what has often been called an archaeological expedition, to find the boxes and the tins under the rubble of the ghetto. This is a photograph showing the day that the archive was finally found, or one cache of the archive was finally found. That's Wasser, with, I believe, Rachel Auerbach, though I've never been able to determine whether that's Rachel Auerbach or Blum, or his wife, Bluma Wasser. But anyway, there they are, looking at what they buried and now have found again.
So the tins were discovered in 1946, but then later, the big milk cans filled with other documents were actually found by accident by Polish construction workers later in 1950.
Right. So there were Polish construction workers were building an apartment house, I believe, new housing on the side of the former ghetto, and they hit metal. And they were excited because everywhere in Poland, people were looking for the valuables that were buried by Jews everywhere throughout Poland, in part, an anti-Semitic trope that Jews had all kinds of wealth to bury, and in part based on the fact that Jews were everywhere burying belongings in hopes that they could return and have the wherewithal to start a new life. And what they discovered is that they had not discovered gold, or not discovered literal gold, and they were about to discard the papers when the foreman of the crew came running over and said, "Don't touch those things." Everything was put in his car. He drove them over to the Jewish Historical Institute, another miracle perhaps, and he knew he was a Christian Pole who had a Jewish girlfriend who had been in the ghetto, and they had been doing some smuggling back and forth, so he knew the value of what was there, and that preserved that cache as well.
Wow. So there's a post-war story of heroism as well, that all of this stuff is able to come to us.
Right.
And I should say that the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw generously has given us on loan one of these milk cans, and we have it in display in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And I have to say, personally, every time I walk through that part and I see the milk can, I appreciate, just how amazing it is that this artifact and all it contains survived all this time, and the scorching of the ghetto and all the wear and tear, and allowed history to be preserved in the words of the Jews themselves.
Yeah. If we wouldn't, as Barbara Kirschenbach-Inlet says, we wouldn't know anything about the Warsaw Ghetto without the Ringelblum archive.
We would only have what the Nazis said about it.
Exactly.
I want to read something that came in from one of our viewers, Kathy, who says, "I'm glad Rachel Auerbach survived and the remnants of the archive were found. Information like this can help quell those who deny the Holocaust happened."
She's right. She's absolutely right. It's there. It's there for anyone to take a look at, and obviously so much more.
Before we close, I want to give you an opportunity to tell us why, in the documentary you made, you told the story from the point of view of Rachel Auerbach rather than, say, Ringelblum himself. What did you like so much about her?
Well, I love Rachel because she's such a feisty person, and because she's so determined and so committed to what she's doing. But also, she was a fantastic, really unparalleled writer, and she was a through line. She knew Ringelblum before the war, was part of his milieu, was in the ghetto running the soup kitchen, and she was one of the few that survived. But not only did she survive, but she spent the rest of her life trying to make sure that people knew about the Onyx Shabbos archive, about Ringelblum, other members of the archive, the writers, poets, artists of the ghetto. And she also started after the second cache of the milk cans was found, she and Wasser and Bluma Wasser, they went to Israel, they emigrated. And she started the Survivor Testimony Department of Yad Vashem. And she was responsible for collecting over 50,000 testimonies. And in fact, she convinced Gideon Hausner, the Israeli state prosecutor who prosecuted Eichmann, to base the Eichmann trial on the words of survivors. And that was really the first time that the world heard the survivors speak.
Yeah, and that was so, so important and had been overlooked in earlier war crimes trials.
Right.
Yeah. Roberta, I want to thank you so much for sharing this history with us and for joining us today.
And thank you for leading our discussion. I enjoyed speaking with you.
Me too. And then to our viewers, thank you for joining us today to learn about the story of the Oneg Shabbat, this massive archive of Jewish history, one of the largest collections that we have to tell the history of the Holocaust in Poland. Today, thanks to the efforts of Emanuel Ringelblum, Hirsch Wasser, and of course, Rachel Auerbach, we know about what happened to Polish Jews, their suffering, but also their resilience and their efforts to make it possible for us to know this history. It's been an honor to share this history with you. See you next time.